I want to talk very briefly about a part of my writing process that I have adapted from my process as an animator that I think would be useful for non-animators to understand, just about kind of how I've developed the techniques that I use for animation and incorporated them into my writing process. I have a bunch of these kind of insights into how the two relate, but I wanted to take a minute briefly to touch on one specific thing that I think is possibly of great value to non-animators to understand, and that might be beneficial to your writing process. One of the 12 principles of animation, as defined in The Illusion of Life by Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston, is it's actually kind of two principles in one. It's called straight ahead and pose to pose. The idea of this is that it's kind of the method of animation that the animator takes depending on the shot. As you know, animation is a bunch of frames struck together to create the illusion of life. And these two methods are used kind of, again, depending on the shot to get you the best results. Straight ahead essentially means that you're starting on frame 1, and then you're doing frame 2, and then frame 3, and then frame 4, and you're just going straight ahead from the beginning. You're doing every frame as you go. To understand why this is important, I guess it's best to understand what the other one is. Pose to pose means that you are doing the individual poses, that like the key poses, the important parts of an action. So let's say, for example, you're doing a baseball throw. You have the pitcher wind up and then pull his arm back and then bring his arm forward to full extension. The fingers are extended, the ball is coming out of the hand, and then there's the overlap where the arm continues to swing through, but the body is still carrying forward. So the idea is that you set those individual poses kind of as drawings. So let's say frame 1 is the standing, kind of just standing there. Frame 8 maybe is the wind up. Frame 12 is full extent of that wind up. Then frame 16 is full extent of the throw itself, and frame 24 is the follow through pose where the arm has swung through but the body's still moving forward. And after you've done that, then you fill in the animation frames in between those. There's more to it. You fill in breakdowns and stuff like that, but hopefully that conveys the general idea. So going back to straight ahead, the kinds of things that are advantageous for straight ahead animation, and I promise this is coming back to writing, but I want you to understand the general idea of the animation purposes for it so that you can see how it relates to writing. But with straight ahead, you might do, for example, let's say you have a tentacle writhing around, and it's not grabbing onto anything, it's just flopped up on the deck of a ship, and it's writhing around, and it doesn't matter exactly where it ends up, so you can kind of just be loose with it. And so straight ahead allows you to just kind of go frame by frame and figure out exactly how the animation works. This very often allows for, first of all, a feeling of spontaneity, and secondly, it allows it to feel more loose and floppy. Now, floppy doesn't necessarily apply to writing, but I promise the looseness will come back. The advantages of pose-to-pose animation are that you can be more precise about the specifics of the animation. You can plan it out ahead of time and know exactly where the character's going to end up at any given time. So hopefully that makes sense, and now I'm going to explain kind of how that ties into writing. One of the things that I have found personally is that I myself don't like to write straight ahead. I don't like to start on page 1 and just see where the story takes me. I think that sometimes you can end up with beautiful work that way. I'm fairly confident that is the method that Neil Gaiman uses, at least maybe in his first pass, because his stories always feel like there's this loose spontaneity, again, bringing back the looseness, There's this spontaneity to the story, and it feels, very much like real life. Real life is spontaneous. Real life is loose. You may have set plans, ahead of time, but you have no idea how today is going to go, at least not in terms of the exact details of it. For myself, I like to write in a pose-to-pose method, so to speak. Pretty much the very first thing that I figure out in a story is, if you can imagine, the story beats as, the keyframes of an animation, like I described the baseball pitch. The very first thing I like to set out is, how does this end? Where are we going with this? And even if that's not the last page of the book, it's the climax perhaps, or the payoff, the thing that the reader is trying to get to. As an example, and I won't spoil anything, but as an example, I'm currently working on the sequel to my novel Animal Control, The Hero's Apprentice. And in the sequel, there's a very specific, very important, very brutal moment that has to happen. And it is the kind of goosebumps moment of the story. It's the moment that I'm trying to bring the reader to. So I set that keyframe, so to speak. I write it down maybe on a 3x5. The way that I handled the first book was I wrote everything out on 3x5s. I figured out the primary beats of the story. I pinned those up to a wall, and then I would go in between those frames, again coming back to the idea of, after you've set the first frame, frame 1 and frame 8, then you fill up the space in between those. So I would kind of do that method where I would start out by blocking everything out, so to speak, by writing down these crucial, critical moments and pinning them up to a wall. And then I would go in and I would break those down. I would figure out what fills in the spaces in between those. And I wouldn't get down to the nitty-gritty of writing dialogue or writing any sort of prose at all. I would just focus on outlining it all. So that by the time I got to the writing part of it, all of the critical ingredients were there. The next step for me was to jump in and start writing. I would have the outline sitting next to me while I wrote, and this I think is the critical point that I want to make, is that I've heard people say that blocking out your story in this method creates a lack of looseness, coming back to the tentacle flopping on the deck. And I strongly disagree with that. And the reason I disagree with that is you have to outline your story in such a way that you can still be loose. I invented entire plot lines, entire characters, entire scenes even, as I was writing. I think the crucial part of writing an outline, of doing the pose-to-pose method, is being willing to adjust when you see something else that works. As an animator, I have this happen every time I animate. I'll be working on a character doing the baseball pitch, and he throws, but then one of the poses that I end up with, maybe his weight is slightly off, and I go, oh, his hips are kind of over to the side. Well, I could fix that so that the weight is proper, or I could go back and just kind of change the ending so that instead of landing on this foot, he kind of fumbles sideways and takes like a double step to catch himself, and it creates this sense of loose spontaneity. Again, I think that this method for writing is perfect, because what it does is it allows you to show where you're headed with something. I mentioned Neil Gaiman earlier, and I am a great respecter of his prose. I don't think that I've ever read anybody who writes more beautiful, just poetry to his wording. But having read several of his books, whenever I pick up one of his books, I'm leery to the idea that he doesn't know where he's actually headed with it. I don't know if that's true or not. Maybe he has those heavy story beats in his head, but my experience with his books has always been that it does have this wonderful looseness to it, but it doesn't seem to necessarily know exactly where it's going. It's kind of a meandering sort of method. You end up with a meandering story. And I don't mean that to take away from anything that Neil Gaiman has done. I think his work is beautiful. As I said, his prose are the best. But for myself as a storyteller, I want to go into the story. I want the reader to come into the story knowing that I know exactly where I'm headed with it, exactly where it's going to end up. So that is something that I think is important as a storyteller, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it, on your method, on whether or not these two concepts of animation make sense to you as storytelling points, and if you would also be interested in hearing more of my kind of adaptations of animation for storytelling. So if so, please let me know. Please comment down below, like this video, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.